The order was simple: kill all 14 of them before the Americans arrived. The list included 2 former prime ministers of France, 2 of the most senior generals in her army, a Wimbledon champion, the son of the man who had beaten Germany in the First World War, and the older sister of Charles de Gaulle. The SS unit sent to carry out the order was loyal to the end. The only thing standing in its way was a drunk American tank captain, a defecting German major, and a French tennis star who had not held a weapon since 1940. None of this is fiction. All of it happened. It is early May 1945. The war in Europe is already over in every way that counts. Hitler is dead. Berlin is smoking. The Red Army has cut the continent in half. The Third Reich, on paper, still exists, but its generals are already signing surrender documents in kitchens and farmhouses from Denmark to northern Italy, except in the Austrian Alps. In the mountains above the town of Wurgel, in a valley tourists will one day come to ski, something has refused to end. A single stone castle, 900 years old, still has its gate closed, still has a guard tower, still has rifles pointed outward. That castle is called Schloss Itter. From a distance, it looks like a postcard. White walls, a single round tower, pine forest climbing the ridge behind it. If you saw a photograph of it in 1945, you would not know that anything dark had ever happened inside. But something is happening inside. 14 of the most important prisoners in Nazi-occupied Europe are locked behind those walls. Their names are known in every capital in the world. Their faces hang in newspapers from London to New York. Some of them once ran France. Some of them nearly destroyed her. A few of them blame each other privately for the fall of the country. And they have, for 2 years, been living in the same building, eating in the same room, refusing to speak. Outside, the SS is coming to kill them. Inside, they've been quietly picking up rifles the guards left behind. What is about to happen on the morning of May 5th, 1945, inside a castle almost nobody in the world is paying attention to, has been called the strangest battle ever fought in the Second World War. To understand why, you have to understand the castle first, and the man who built it into a prison. Castle Itter has stood on its hill for more than 900 years. It was first mentioned in a land record in the year 1241. For centuries, it belonged to bishops, then to counts, then to wealthy private families who used it as a summer retreat. A pianist named Sophie Minter owned it in the 1880s and hosted Tchaikovsky there for a full summer. Liszt visited. Wagner was said to have admired the view. It was, for almost all of its history, a very peaceful building that ended in April of 1943. The German Reich requisitioned the castle, emptied the caretakers, and handed it over to the SS. On paper, it became a sub-camp of Dachau, the main concentration camp in southern Germany, 60 miles to the north. But the SS did not send political prisoners, or Jews, or Soviet POWs to Schloss Itter. The SS sent its most valuable hostages. Heinrich Himmler had a specific category for these prisoners. He called them Ehrenhaftlänge, Honorprisoners, a German bureaucratic euphemism for something very specific. People too important to kill and too dangerous to release. People who might, someday, be useful. People who could be traded. People who could be paraded. People who, in the right combination, might be used to force a negotiated peace. The Reich had a few such facilities scattered across Germany and Austria. Itter was the one reserved for the French. And what the SS did to it, architecturally, was unusual. They did not strip the castle. They did not fit it with the machinery of death familiar from other concentration camps. There were no gallows, no crematoria, no whipping posts in the courtyard. Instead, they kept the tapestries. They kept the chandeliers. They kept the library intact and added new books in French. They installed a piano. They staffed the kitchen with a Czech cook pulled from Dachau, a man who had once cooked for minor Austrian nobility. They opened the wine cellar for special occasions. From the inside, if you ignored the bars on the windows and the machine gun post above the gate, it almost looked like a hotel. But the SS never forgets its job. The commandant of Itter was a man named Sebastian Wimmer, 43 years old, a career SS officer, a former Gestapo interrogator from Lodz who had personally taken part in the murder of Polish civilians earlier in the war. He was known to drink heavily. He was known to beat his own staff. The wine in the cellar was mostly for him. His orders were blunt. Keep the prisoners alive until further notice. And if orders change, kill them all. The prisoners knew this. They had always known this. That is what made Schloss Itter one of the strangest prisons in history. The food was good. The rooms were warm. The prisoners could walk the courtyard, read in the library, and through the lower windows watch the Austrian Alps go blue in the evening. And they knew that on any given morning, a single phone call from Berlin could end all of it. They lived under that call for 2 years. 2 years of waiting to be murdered in a castle that smelled like fresh bread. Who were they? These 14 people Hitler kept locked in the Austrian mountains. Why were they chosen? And why, if they were so important, did he not kill them earlier when the Reich still had the time and the guards and the trains to do it? The answer is almost embarrassing. Hitler kept them alive because he thought, to the very end, that he might still win the war. And if he did, he believed they would be useful to him as trophies. And if he lost the war, he believed they would be useful to someone else's corpses. So let us meet them, one at a time, the way the SS guards saw them, every morning filing out of their rooms for breakfast. The first prisoner is a small man, very neatly dressed, with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanently severe expression. His name is Paul Reynaud. On May 21st, 1940, Reynaud was the Prime Minister of the French Republic. The German army was pouring through the Ardennes. Panzers were 20 miles from Paris. Reynaud stood in front of the French Senate and, in a clipped voice, gave a speech that would define the rest of his life. France will not surrender. 3 weeks later, Reynaud was the prime minister of a country that had surrendered. His cabinet forced him out. He was replaced by Marshal Pétain, who signed the armistice the next day. Reynaud, who had refused to sign, was arrested by the Vichy regime and then, in 1942, handed over to the Germans. By 1945, he has been in Nazi custody for almost 3 years. He has not seen his children. He is traveling with a woman who is not his wife, Christiane Mabayer, his private secretary, his companion, the woman who insisted on sharing his captivity. Reynaud is 66 years old. He is furious at almost everyone, especially the man who arrives at breakfast next, Edouard Daladier, the prime minister before Reynaud. Daladier is the man who signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938, the handshake photograph, alongside Chamberlain, that became shorthand for Western appeasement. He tried to prevent war. He failed. He was replaced by Reynaud in 1940. He was arrested by Vichy the same year. Reynaud and Daladier blame each other for the fall of France. Privately, publicly, constantly. Reynaud says Daladier let the army rot. Daladier says Reynaud lost the war in 3 weeks. They have, for 5 years, refused to share a table. The next man has a military bearing that has not relaxed in 40 years. General Maxime Weygand, 78 years old, a legend from the First World War. In May of 1940, Reynaud appointed him supreme commander of the French army, hoping he would stop the German advance. Weygand looked at the map, looked at Reynaud, and told him the war was lost. He recommended an armistice. He later served the Vichy government. Some Frenchmen consider him a collaborator. Reynaud considers him a traitor. Reynaud has not shaken Weygand's hand in 5 years. When Weygand enters the dining room, Reynaud turns his chair. When Vagon passes close enough to hear, Reynaud uses a specific French word, just loud enough to carry. Traitor. The fourth man is older still, General Maurice Gamelin. Gamelin was supreme commander before Vagon. He was the man in charge of the French army when the Germans attacked in May of 1940. 9 days in, Reynaud fired him. Gamelin has never forgiven Reynaud, but he has forgiven Vagon even less, because Vagon replaced him, blamed him for the defeat, and helped Pétain seize power. So Gamelin, the man Reynaud fired, sits at Reynaud's table, because the enemy of his enemy is the only person in the castle he can stomach. The next prisoner stands out. He is tall. He is athletic. He is 46 years old and, somehow, moves like a man of 25. His name is Jean Barotra. Barotra is not a politician. He is a tennis player, but not just any tennis player. He is one of the four men who in the 1920s dominated world tennis so thoroughly they were nicknamed the Four Musketeers of France. Twice the champion of Wimbledon, champion of the French Open 4 times, champion of Australia. He was called the Bounding Bass for the way he leaped at the net. In the 1930s, he became a businessman. Under Vichy, he took a post as Commissioner General for Sports. Then, in 1942, he tried to sneak out of France to join the Allies in North Africa. The Gestapo caught him. They did not execute him. They put him in Itter. Inside the castle, Barotra is the most physically capable prisoner by a wide margin. Everyone else has noticed. The sixth prisoner is a quiet man in his 60s with a heavy mustache and a heavy name. Michel Clemenceau, son of Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger, the French prime minister who led France to victory in the First World War. The man who stood in front of Kaiser Wilhelm's delegation at Versailles in 1919 and dictated the terms that crushed Germany. And now his son is a prisoner of the Germans. Michel was arrested for resistance activity. He is quieter than the politicians. He drinks less. He reads more. He is, the guards have noticed, the only prisoner who speaks politely to everyone, including Vagon. The seventh prisoner almost did not survive the journey to Itter. She is a woman of 55 with gray hair, a stubborn chin, and a spine that has not quite recovered from where a guard broke it. Her name is Marie-Agnes Callio, the older sister of Charles de Gaulle. Marie-Agnes and her husband ran a resistance network in Paris that smuggled down Allied airmen through France into Spain. They were arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. She was sent to Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp. She survived it, barely, when her brother became the symbolic leader of Free France. The SS pulled her out of Ravensbrück and transferred her to Itter, alive, as insurance. She is the most dangerous hostage in the castle, because killing her means killing something Charles de Gaulle will never forgive. The remaining prisoners round out the impossible group. François de la Roque, a decorated First World War officer and leader of a far-right nationalist league in the 1930s. Violently anti-communist, later a resistance organizer. Arrested by the Germans in 1943, Léon Jouot, the leader of France's largest trade union, the CGT nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize before the war. The ideological opposite of La Roque in almost every possible way. Jouot's partner, Auguste Bruchlin, is imprisoned with him. So is Vagon's wife. So is La Roque's son. By the spring of 1945, the population of Castle Itter is 19 people total, 14 formal prisoners and their loved ones. And 2 years of shared captivity have done absolutely nothing to make them a group. They are a collection of enemies, locked together, waiting to be murdered. The dining room of Schloss Itter is not large. It is a rectangular room on the second floor, with tall windows overlooking the courtyard, an arched wooden ceiling, and 3 long tables arranged end to end along the length of the floor. Under the old Austrian counts who owned the castle, It had seated a single extended family. Under the SS, it seats 3 separate tables who do not speak. At the first table sits Maxime Weygand. Beside him, his wife. Beside her, Jean Barotra and his wife. At the end of the table, François de Larac. They are very roughly the conservatives, the Catholics, the men who believed in 1940 that France's salvation lay in honorable surrender and a moral rebirth under Pétain. By 1945, only Weygand still believes this. Larac and Barotra have, in their own ways, betrayed Vichy. But old loyalties are hard to set aside at breakfast. At the second table sits Paul Reynaud. Beside him, Christian Mabier. Across from him, Maurice Gamelin. At the end, Michel Clemenceau. They are, very roughly, the Republicans, the men of the Third Republic, the men who believed France had lost the war not because it was decadent, but because it was poorly led by the men at the first table. At the third table, alone, sits Léon Jouot, with his partner Augusta and the rotating handful of prisoners who have decided, for the sake of their own sanity, to align with neither camp. Jouot is a trade unionist. To Larac at the first table, he is a communist in all but name. To Weygand, he is a destroyer of hierarchies. Larac has, in public, called Jouot's movement a disease. Jouot has, in print, called Larac's movement a road to fascism. They live 7 meters apart. They have never addressed a single word to each other. This arrangement has held, day by day, for 2 full years. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Soup passed along the first table. Bread passed along the second. Silence across the aisles. The SS guards who walk up and down the room watching the meat have been entertained by this for months. But in the last week of April 1945, something changes at all 3 tables at the same time. The radio. There is a small wireless radio in one of the common rooms. Officially forbidden, unofficially tolerated, because Commandant Wimmer is drunk most evenings and does not bother to enforce the rule. The prisoners cluster around it in 1s and 2s. They hear the BBC. They hear Radio Moscow. They hear the German broadcasts become thinner and more hysterical. On April 25th, American and Soviet troops meet at the Elbe River. Germany is cut in half. On April 28th, Benito Mussolini is shot by Italian partisans and hung by his ankles in a Milan gas station. On April 30th, 1945, the radio reports that Adolf Hitler has killed himself in a bunker in Berlin. The prisoners all hear it at roughly the same time, and something in the dining room shifts that afternoon. For the first time since the castle opened, Reynaud crosses the center aisle. He walks past Weygand, still does not speak to him, and stops at Jouot's table. He says quietly, "We need to think about what happens when the guards decide to leave." Jouot nods. That night, after dinner, Reynaud crosses the aisle a second time. He stops at Weygand's table. He does not look at Weygand. He looks at Barotra. "How fast can you still run?" Barotra smiles for the first time in weeks. The 3 tables are still separate, but they are, at last, whispering to each other, because all 3 tables have reached the same conclusion at the same time. Hitler is dead. The guards have nothing left to protect. The only thing they have left to do, in their final act of loyalty to a Reich that no longer exists, is their final order: kill the prisoners and disappear. On May 2nd, 1945, the prisoners wake up to a strange silence. There are no footsteps on the upper gallery. There is no radio playing in the commandant's office. There is no smoke from the guardhouse chimney. The castle, for the first time in 2 years, feels empty. Sebastian Wimmer is gone. Sometime during the night, the commandant of Schloss Itter packed a single suitcase, shoved his wife and children into a black staff car, emptied what was left of the cellar into the trunk, and drove out of the gate without leaving a note. He did not lock the cells. He did not set fire to the castle. He did not execute the prisoners. He simply left. And most of his SS garrison, watching him go, understood that the order to stay had just walked out of the building. Within hours, the remaining guards began to disappear. Some of them walked out in civilian clothes they had been hoarding for weeks. A few took rifles with them. A few left everything behind. A half-eaten breakfast, a pile of unopened letters, a pistol on a table. By late morning of May 2nd, there were no guards in the castle at all. The prisoners did not immediately celebrate, because they understood something Wimmer had not understood. The order to kill them had not been canceled. It had just been delegated. 40 miles away, in a mountain valley south of Itter, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, a veteran unit known by its nickname, Gotz von Berlichingen, was still operational, still taking orders, still carrying out reprisals, still executing Austrian civilians who put white sheets out of their windows. The SS, in the first week of May 1945, did not care that Hitler was dead or that the Reich had already been split in two. The SS cared about its unfinished business, and Schloss Itter was unfinished business. The prisoners moved fast. They found the castle armory, a small locked room on the ground floor, and pried it open with a crowbar from the kitchen. Inside were rifles, Panzerfausts, boxes of ammunition, and roughly a dozen MP-40 submachine guns the SS had left behind in their hurry. Reynaud took a rifle. Clemenceau took a rifle. Barotra, who had not held a weapon since his military service in the 1920s, picked up a submachine gun and surprised everyone by knowing how to load it. Weygand refused a weapon. So did Gamelin. So, pointedly, did Larocque's son, who was 15 years old and had never fired a gun. Then the prisoners sat down in the dining room, across all three tables for the first time in 2 years, and tried to decide what to do next. The answer was not complicated. They needed help. There were 19 people, most of them over 60, in a castle that the SS could reach in half a day. They needed to find the Americans. 2 prisoners volunteered. The first was a Yugoslav handyman named Zvonimir Kakovic. Kakovic was a political prisoner from Croatia who had been transferred to Itter to do maintenance work. He spoke German. He knew the back roads toward Innsbruck. On the afternoon of May 2nd, the other prisoners handed him a letter, a handwritten note signed by Reynaud, explaining in French, English, and German that the occupants of Schloss Itter were French state prisoners and requesting immediate military assistance. Kakovic walked out of the gate in his work clothes and started toward Innsbruck, 60 miles on foot, through territory the SS still controlled. The second volunteer was the castle cook. His name was Andreas Krobot. Krobot was Czech. He was gentle. He had been cooking for the prisoners for a year and a half, and they trusted him. He found an old bicycle in a shed behind the kitchen, pumped up the tires, and pedaled out of the castle the following morning with a second copy of the same letter in his pocket. He did not head for Innsbruck. He headed for the closest town in the valley below, a town called Wurgl. Andreas Krobot reached Wurgl on the afternoon of May 3rd. What he found there he did not expect. Wurgl was a small alpine town, a railway junction, a church, a few cobblestone streets. In any normal week of the war, it would have been full of Wehrmacht soldiers and SS patrols. But by May of 1945, Wurgl had become something stranger. A town in open, low-level rebellion. The Austrian resistance had taken it. Not the Austrian resistance of legend. Not a vast underground army, because no such thing had ever really existed in Austria, but a specific network of local people, mostly in their 20s, who had spent the last months quietly waiting for the chance to switch sides. A man named Aloys led the Wurgl cell. He had just liberated the town's local government offices from SS control 2 nights before Krobot arrived. And inside those offices, standing in a Wehrmacht uniform with his rank insignia still intact, was a man who had, 12 hours earlier, been the problem. Major Joseph Gangl. Gangl was a career soldier, 34 years old, born in Bavaria, veteran of the Eastern Front. 2 years of frozen trench fighting outside Leningrad, veteran of Normandy. He had been awarded the Iron Cross for actions in June of 1944, a decorated, disciplined, deeply professional Wehrmacht officer, and a man who had, at some point in the long retreat back through France, stopped believing in the war. Gangl had watched SS units execute French civilians in reprisal. He had watched his own Wehrmacht commanders turn a blind eye. By the time his unit withdrew into Austria in the spring of 1945, he had made a private decision. Whatever orders came next, he would not carry them out if they involved shooting civilians. When the SS ordered Wurgel and the surrounding valley to be held to the last man, which in practice meant destroying every bridge, burning every farm, and executing anyone who surrendered, Gangl refused. He took his remaining men, fewer than 20 of them, and made contact with Alois Mayer. On May 3rd, he formally switched sides. 12 hours later, a Czech cook on a bicycle walked into his office and handed him a letter from Paul Reynaud. Gangl read the letter twice. He understood immediately what it meant. He also understood what he did not have. He did not have enough men. He did not have armor. He did not have heavy weapons. If the 17th SS decided to attack Schloss Itter in force, his 20 men with rifles would not stop them. He needed Americans. He also knew where to find them. The U.S. 12th Armored Division had crossed the German-Austrian border 2 days earlier. Its forward elements were moving south, meeting almost no resistance. Gangl got behind the wheel of a Kübelwagen, a German jeep, tied a white flag to the radio antenna, and drove it himself, alone, across the no-man's land between Wurgel and the American advance. He made contact near the town of Kufstein. The first American officer who agreed to hear him out was a 27-year-old tank commander from Norwich, New York, Captain John C. Lee, Jr., known to his men as Jack. Stocky, dark-haired, chain-smoking, with a permanent half-squint and a reputation for following orders only when he felt like it. He had been running the same Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, since Normandy. His men respected him. His superiors found him exhausting. Gangl stepped out of the Kübelwagen with his hands raised, saluted, introduced himself in careful English, and made his case. There were 14 French state prisoners 40 miles to the east, 2 former prime ministers, 2 former commanders-in-chief, the older sister of Charles de Gaulle. The SS was closing in to kill them. He, Gangl, had 20 Wehrmacht soldiers and a personal commitment to see this through. Would Captain Lee help him? Jack Lee thought about it for about 90 seconds. He asked his superior. His superior looked out the window, shrugged, and said something that became a kind of legend inside the 12th Armored Division. "Do whatever you want, Captain." Lee turned to Gangl. He said, in English, "Let's go find your castle." They shook hands. At that moment, in that handshake, something happened that had not happened anywhere else in the entire Second World War. An officer of the American Army and an officer of the Wehrmacht had just agreed to fight together against the SS. The task force assembled at dusk on May 4th. It was small. It was strange-looking. It would, if photographed, have been one of the most unusual military formations in the entire war. At the head of the column, Besotten Jenny, Lee's Sherman tank, caked in dust, its machine guns oiled, its loader checking rounds one more time before they rolled. Behind the tank, 2 American half-tracks carrying 14 GIs from the 23rd Tank Battalion. Lee's hand-picked men. Most of them had never spoken to a German soldier in their lives, except to take him prisoner. Behind the half-tracks, a Kübelwagen carrying Gangl and his translator. Behind the Kübelwagen, a truck carrying 10 Wehrmacht soldiers in full field uniform, iron crosses still on their collars, MP-40 submachine guns on their laps. They were about to move through Austrian countryside, still crawling with retreating German units. If any of those units saw them, the first question would be, why are the Americans driving behind Wehrmacht? Gangel's answer was simple. Do not stop. Do not wave. Move through. They reached the road that wound up to Schloss Itter around 10 o'clock at night. On the way, they acquired one more defender. In the small village of Itter, at the bottom of the castle hill, a man stepped out of a farmhouse and waved the convoy down. He was wearing civilian clothes. He was thin. He had a bandage on one arm. He was a former Waffen-SS officer named Kurt Siegfried Schrader. Schrader had deserted weeks earlier. He had been hiding in Itter village with his family. Over the previous months, he had befriended several of the French prisoners during the periods when Wimmer allowed short, supervised walks outside the castle walls. And he had, in his own quiet way, been helping them pass messages. He asked to join the defense. Gangel looked at Lee. Lee looked at Gangel. Neither of them could quite believe the sentence they had just heard. An SS officer wanted to help defend the castle against the SS. Lee waved him into the half-track. The task force rolled up to the castle gate a little before midnight. The great wooden doors of Schloss Itter swung open from the inside. And the strangest single moment of the entire Second World War occurred in that courtyard. Paul Reynaud, former Prime Minister of France, walked out into the cold mountain air and shook the hand of Captain Jack Lee. Then he turned, and without hesitation, shook the hand of Major Joseph Gangel, a prime minister who had once declared war on Germany. A German major who had, 3 years earlier, been fighting Frenchmen in the same war. Two enemies who, in the space of a single handshake, had just agreed to die for each other if they had to. The gates closed behind them. Dawn was 4 hours away. The SS came at first light. They came fast, and they came organized, and they came in numbers the defenders could not match. Between 100 and 150 soldiers of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, veterans, loyalists, men who had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes and had, every step of the retreat, watched their war fall apart around them. For these men, Schloss Itter was not a strategic target. It was a final act, a last piece of unfinished business. The prisoners inside represented everything they had been told for 12 years was weakening Germany. Old aristocrats, communists, collaborators who had turned, and the sister of a French general whose broadcasts they had cursed at for 5 years. They had come to make it right. At approximately 4 in the morning on May 5th, 1945, the first machine gun fire from the tree line below the castle tore into the outer wall. Inside the castle, men and women, some of them in their 70s, scrambled to their firing positions. Lee took the main gate with his American gunners. He had positioned Besatin Jenny directly in front of the entrance, her main gun pointed down the access road. Gangel took the south wall with his Wehrmacht soldiers. The south wall overlooked the forested slope the SS was most likely to use for a concentrated rush. Schrader took a tower on the north side, a man who knew SS tactics from the inside and could read their movements before they made them. The prisoners took positions on the interior walls. Paul Reynaud, 66 years old, knelt at a second-floor window with a bolt-action rifle and began loading magazines for the man next to him. That man was Jean Barotra, the tennis champion, the bounding Basque, who was now handling a submachine gun with the focus he once used on a center court at Wimbledon. Michel Clemenceau, 68, took a position in the courtyard. Léon Jouot, 74, took a window above the main gate. François de la Roque, despite a heart condition, took his rifle to the east wall. Christian Mabayer, Reynaud's partner, moved between rooms carrying ammunition, and, At one point that morning, picked up a German hand grenade that had rolled onto the dining room floor and threw it back out the window. She had never thrown a grenade before in her life. Not every prisoner fought. General Weygand stayed in his room with his wife. The door closed, his hands folded in his lap. He had surrendered France 5 years earlier. He would not take up arms now. General Gamelin stayed in his own room, a book open on his knee, refusing to speak to anyone. Marie-Agnes Caillot, the sister of de Gaulle, was too frail from Ravensbrück to hold a weapon steady. She sat in an inner hallway, back against a wall, and counted the minutes. The battle lasted more than 11 hours. In the first hour, the SS closed to within 30 yards of the main gate. Bissatin and Jenny's machine guns held them off long enough for Gangel's Wehrmacht soldiers to reposition on the south wall. In the second hour, the SS pulled back and began systematic fire on the outer walls with mortars and a heavy machine gun they had positioned on a rise to the southeast. In the third hour, they brought up a field gun, an 88mm gun, the single most feared German weapon of the war. A shell from that gun found Bissatin Jenny at approximately 9 in the morning. The tank was destroyed. Lee and his crew escaped with their lives. They fell back into the courtyard and continued fighting on foot. By 11 o'clock, the castle was low on ammunition. The defenders were still holding every wall, but they were rationing rounds. Gangel had taken personal command of the southern approach. Lee had set up a fallback position in the main hall. The prisoners on the upper floors were firing single shots only. And outside, the SS was regrouping for what looked like a final assault. Gangel made the call. They needed reinforcement, and they needed it now. The American relief column that Lee had called for was somewhere behind them on the road. Someone had to find it and lead it in. Someone had to get out of the castle alive. Jean Barotra volunteered. Barotra was 46. He had not competed in world-class tennis for years, but he was still the fastest human being in the castle. He removed his jacket. He tightened his belt. He climbed to the lowest point of the outer wall, where a section of masonry had collapsed decades earlier. He looked over the top, waited for a lull in the machine gun fire, and then vaulted the wall. 40 yards of open ground, snow in patches, grass, no cover at all. He ran. An SS machine gun team on the south ridge saw him. They opened fire. The rounds kicked up dirt around his feet. Barotra did what he had done at Wimbledon for 20 years. He changed direction. He zigzagged. He found a geometry that the gunners could not quite track. He reached the tree line. He kept running. 9 kilometers downhill through forest past 2 SS patrols he evaded by dropping into undergrowth and not moving for 20 minutes at a time. He reached the road to Wurgel just before noon. He flagged down a jeep from the American 142nd Infantry Regiment, which was already on its way to Itter, responding to Lee's earlier radio calls. He asked for a uniform, and then Jean Barotra, Wimbledon champion, prisoner of the Reich, 46-year-old civilian, put on American fatigues and climbed back into the jeep to ride back to the castle he had just escaped from. But before the relief column could reach Itter, one more thing happened. It happened at approximately 11:45 in the morning. Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister of France, had been firing from a second-floor window for hours. A concentration of SS gunfire had been building against that section of wall. Rounds were coming through the frame. The wall plaster was breaking apart around him. Reynaud did not see the sniper move into position on the ridge across the valley. Someone else did. Major Joseph Gangel, former Wehrmacht officer, Austrian resistance leader, the man who had driven a Kubel wagon across no man's land to beg an American captain for help, saw the sniper line up his shot. He moved without thinking. He pulled Reynaud out of the line of fire. The sniper's round found Gangel instead. He died before he hit the floor. He was the only defender killed that day. At 4 in the afternoon, the lead elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment broke through the SS perimeter and onto the castle road. Their tanks rolled past the burning wreck of besotten Jenny. The SS attackers, caught between the castle walls and the American armor, broke and ran. About 100 of them were captured. The rest vanished into the forest. Schloss Itter had held. Every prisoner had survived. 3 days later, Germany surrendered. What do you do as a historian with a story like this? Because the Battle of Castle Itter does not fit the shape of the Second World War. It has the wrong uniforms on the wrong sides. It has the wrong people doing the shooting. It has the wrong people being saved. And underneath the story, layered one on top of the other, there are 5 quiet ironies. You cannot read about what happened at Itter without noticing them. The first irony is this. In the last ground combat of a European war, Americans and Germans fought side by side. For 6 years, 2 countries had tried to destroy each other across 2 oceans and a continent. Millions had died between them, and the final firefight, the one that ended it all in the West, ended with American and German soldiers passing ammunition to each other across the same castle wall. The second irony, a prisoner of the Third Reich was saved by the body of a Wehrmacht officer. Paul Reynaud, the man who had declared war on Germany in 1940, lived because Joseph Gangel, a decorated officer of the German army, stepped in front of a bullet meant for him. The third irony, the men who surrendered France in 1940, the politicians, the generals, the commanders of the collapse, did not surrender the castle in 1945. But it was not all of them who fought. Weygand, the general who had personally argued for the armistice, sat in his room with the door closed. Gamelin, his rival, did the same. The men who had surrendered a country could not bring themselves to surrender a single building. But they could not fight for it either. They sat and waited. The fourth irony, the prisoners held the castle together. They did not, afterwards, love each other. Reynaud and Daladier still hated each other. Reynaud and Weygand still hated each other. Gamelin and Weygand still hated each other. They did not reconcile. They did not forgive. They did not walk arm in arm out of the courtyard when the battle was over. They picked up their suitcases, boarded the American trucks that took them down the mountain, and resumed the same arguments they had been having since 1940. The only thing they had ever agreed on was that they would not let each other die. And the fifth irony, the last battle of the Second World War in Europe was fought to save people almost nobody politically wanted to save. Charles de Gaulle did not trust most of the prisoners in that castle. He distrusted Weygand. He distrusted Daladier. He would spend the next decade quietly making sure none of them regained real power in post-war France. The Americans had no political use for them. The British had never liked most of them. They were rescued not because they mattered. They were rescued because killing them would have been, even at the end of a war that had killed 60 million people, something too dark to allow. And somebody, an American tank captain, a Wehrmacht major, a French tennis player, a Czech cook on a bicycle, decided quietly that was reason enough. Most of the people who walked out of Schloss Itter on the evening of May 5th, 1945, are gone now. Paul Reynaud flew to Paris 3 days later. Within 48 hours of landing, he was demanding the prosecution of Maxime Weygand for collaboration. The feud continued in courtrooms and newspaper columns for years. Weygand was tried, acquitted, and died in 1965. He never spoke to Gamelin again. Gamelin died a year later. The two generals, who had hated each other for 25 years, did not reconcile. Jean Barotra went back to tennis. He played competitive Wimbledon until he was 65 years old. He gave interviews about the castle until the end of his life. He was always asked about the wall. He always said the same thing. It was not the fastest I have ever run, but it was the most important. Jacques Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross. He returned to Norwich, New York. He drank heavily. He died in 1973, a quiet private citizen, and his obituary barely mentioned the castle. Marie Agnes Callio went home. Her brother, Charles, became president of France. The town of Wurgel named a street after Joseph Gangle. He is considered today a hero of the Austrian resistance. The street is not large. Schloss Itter still stands in its valley in North Tyrol. It is privately owned. It is closed to the public. From the road, it looks almost exactly as it did in 1945. White walls, one round tower, pine forest climbing behind it. If you ever drive past it, you will not know what happened there. The strangest battle of the Second World War was not fought for a country. It was fought inside one building by people who did not agree on anything, except that at the very end, they would not let each other die. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more lost battles of the Second World War. And tell me in the comments, which of the 14 prisoners inside that castle would you have wanted to have dinner with? Across the aisle, of course.